I'm glad to have you tuned in with us today. We're going to cover a pretty good bit of ground in our study in the book of Romans this morning, but uh, while you're turning, grab your Bible to Romans chapter 3, please, and that's where we'll pick up with our study here in just a few moments. But while you're turning there, I just want to say that, I was looking out the window this morning here in Sherman, and it's Monday, the 27th of April, and it's a beautiful day. It's a beautiful spring-like day. The sun hasn't been very bright this morning because we're a little bit overcast and cloudy, but it's a very calm morning, and hear lawnmowers running in the distance. And you look around, the trees are all in uh, full leaf. Many of the spring flowers are in full bloom. And if it weren't for the fact that we were all a bit on edge because of being separated due to the coronavirus that has been such a frightening thing for the world around us. Today would be otherwise the perfect day. And I'm going to suggest to you that it is a perfect day. And that, in fact, probably the only thing different about today and what's led up to today relative to this virus situation, probably the main thing that's different about today in this circumstance is the fact that God opened the door of understanding or of knowledge for us to know some things that probably have always been. In other words, sometimes we have a difficult time accepting the fact that we live in a volatile and dangerous environment. And that's not just true physically, that's true spiritually. And it's almost as if we're a little bit surprised or shocked when we come to understand, when we receive information relative to how dangerous and uh, how frightening it can be to live in a fallen world. Uh, I want to offer you some reassurance and some comfort in that. God is as in control today as He's ever been before. And that's, of course, in absolute control. In absolute control. So if you're struggling with your outlook, if you're struggling with fears and anxieties, I'm not going to advise you not to be wise, to be discerning, and to observe hygienic practices that would limit your exposure or eliminate your exposure if possible to this virus. I certainly don't. I'm not going to encourage you not to do that. But I am going to encourage you to remember that at the end of the day, and the end of this virus season, God still controls the destiny of men and the outcome of the world. He's still as powerful now as he's ever been before. And again, he and he alone sustain us, not just through difficult times, but through times where we think things are going well, when if we knew the whole story, we would realize that maybe we were in more danger then than we even are now, only unaware of it. Okay, enough about all that. Let's get to Romans chapter 3 this morning. I know that we've been in the first three chapters of Romans for several weeks now, and we're gonna for the sake of getting to some much more encouraging news, much more positive in the sense of talking about the gospel. We're going to move through chapter 3, the first 20 verses of chapter 3, in a pretty rapid succession this morning, in pretty quick fashion, not overlooking or saying that it's any less important, just that we're so anxious to get to verse 21, where the whole tide turns, if you will, as to the revelation of God in the person of Jesus Christ and what that offers and provides for us. Because up until now, you remember, beginning all the way back in chapter 1, verse 18, and going through the end of our text this morning, chapter 3, verse 20, uh, all we're talking about are the primary current of the text is to convince us, to prove to us that men left to be judged by their own performance under law, any law, every law, always conclude, always reach the same outcome, and that is condemned, guilty, and separated from God. There are none righteous, and we're going to find, in fact, that's a direct quote from Scripture that we're going to read and refer to for a minute this morning. Let's start in Romans chapter 3 with verse 1, and let's read down through the first 20 verses together. What advantage, then, is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? Much in every way, verse 2 says. First of all, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. What if some were unfaithful? Verse 3 says. Would their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true and every human a liar, as it's written, so that you may be proven right when you speak and prevail when you judge. But if our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we say? That God is unjust in bringing his wrath upon us? I'm using a human argument, Paul says. Certainly not. If that were so, how could God judge the world? Someone might argue that if my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? Why not say, verse 8, Paul says, as some slanderously claim that we say, let's do evil so that good may result. Their condemnation is just, Paul says. What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all, for we've already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. As it's written, there's no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away, and they together have become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are as open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips, and their mouths are filled with cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery marks their way, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know, verse 19 says, that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by works of law. Rather, through law, we become conscious of our sins. Now, you remember as we left off last week, we were talking about beginning back in chapter 2, verse 17. Paul turns his specific focus in making the case about the universal condemnation of men. He turns his discussion to specifically dealing with the Jews and their spiritual condition. Now, as we've said so many times, in fact, the Jews would have been eager to agree that the Gentiles, the non-Jewish population of the earth, were certainly condemned, were outside of a relationship with God. They would have been quick to agree with that indictment. But when Paul turns his attention to the Jews and they discover that they've been no better at keeping law than the Gentiles have, that they've misunderstood the nature of circumcision and used it as an evidence of a relationship that they really don't have with God, that really doesn't exist with God, then they're forced to conclude. They're forced to ask, well, then what advantage is there to being a Jew? I mean, if Paul, what you're saying is true, Jews and Gentiles are in the same position. They're in the same spiritual situation relative to God. There's several questions, and I think that Paul, rather than answering specific questions that have been asked, and it may have been that they were asked, but rather than addressing specific questions, Paul, being a Jew, he would have readily understood and easily anticipated just exactly what the Jews were thinking when they heard what Paul was teaching in this section. When Paul said that the Jew is in the same spiritual condition as the Gentile, then the Jews would naturally have had all kinds of questions designed to discredit the conclusion that Paul's drawn. Okay? It can't be. That can't be true. It can't be that Gentiles and Jews are in the same spiritual condition. Paul, you're out of your mind. That's not possible. So we go through a series of possibilities or scenarios that could have been questions and certainly are anticipated by Paul as being questions that the Jews would have had, designed to discredit this doctrine, this idea that Jews and Gentiles are both equally condemned, when obviously the Jews had been so specially treated by God. Now, the first question that's asked in verse 1 is exactly that question. He said, "What advantage then is there to being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision?" That's the question that they're asking, Paul. If we're in the same boat the Gentiles are in, if what you say is true, then there's no reason, there's no advantage, there's no purpose for us ever having been called the people of God. There's no reason for us to have been or to be circumcised. What advantage then is there to being a Jew or to being circumcised? Paul answers the question in verse 2 by saying much advantage, much in every way. First, however, he says, and not, well, first and foremost, is the fact that the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. You see, the Jews had been given more revelation from God than anybody else had ever received. They'd been given more insight into the nature and the character of God. They'd been given more law than anybody else had. And then, in fact, he said, you have been entrusted with the very words of God. You've been the keeper, if you will, of God's more comprehensive revelation compared to the Gentiles. But you remember back last time in our lesson, Paul says, you remember those of you who pride yourself in being instructors of the law. You're convinced to be a guide, being a guide for the blind, a light for those in darkness, an instructor of those who are foolish, a teacher of little children, because in the law you have the embodiment of knowledge and truth. But you who teach others, he says, do you teach yourself? You say it's wrong. You say it's wrong, for example, to steal. Do you steal? Do you practice idolatry when you so violently oppose it? And then he comes to verse 24 of chapter 2, and he says, just as it has been written, God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. In other words, the Jews are in no better spiritual condition than the Gentiles in relation to their observance of law. Now, Paul says that rather than being the beacon of hope and the beacon of light, the good steward of those things to which you've been entrusted, you've failed utterly at producing righteousness from not just a little bit of law, but even from a great amount of law. Therefore, he says, while there are many advantages to having been a Jew, and of course we could talk about the promised land, we could talk about a lot of things that the Old Testament details that place the Jews in an advantageous position, physically speaking, morally speaking, politically speaking, and if men were able to live by law, even spiritually speaking, but such isn't the case. They became very hypocritical. Hence, when Jesus came to earth, who, by the way, was the prophesied Messiah, when Jesus came to earth, rather than accept him eagerly, for the most part, the Jews rejected him wholeheartedly. They in fact, were totally unprepared for what the scripture, what the revelation of God should have prepared them for. But in asking the question, well, Paul, if what you're saying is true, then it's no blessing, it's no benefit, it's no advantage to having been called to be a Jew. And Paul said, no, you're wrong about that. There are many advantages. Many advantages. First and foremost of which is the fact that you have received a revelation from God that's more detailed, that's more comprehensive than anyone's ever received before. So they come to verse 3 and said, well, what if some were unfaithful? What if some were unfaithful? Will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Not at all. Let God be true, and every human being a liar, just as it's been written, so that you may be proven right when you speak and prevail when you judge. God made promises, Jews would say. God promised us some things. He has to be faithful. He has to accept us. It's almost as if, and of course, again, Paul's anticipating the arguments that the Jews would have had relative to this doctrine of all men being condemned, Jews included. He's anticipating the argument. And it's almost as if Paul would anticipate or expect that some people would say, we have God over the barrel, so to speak. Now, they wouldn't have said that, okay? But the outcome of their argument, the conclusion of their reasoning would have been something along the lines of, God's made promises, and if he's going to be faithful, if he's going to bring about what he said he was going to bring about, if we really are going to be God's people, if we really are going to be God's kingdom, then he's going to have to accept us whether we're righteous or unrighteous. He's going to have to accept us even if we've been unfaithful, Paul, as you suggest that we have been. And Paul says, no. And the reason is because all the promises of God have been universally contingent upon faith from men. In other words, God didn't make an unconditioned promise about salvation, even in the Old Covenant. It was always conditioned on the faith and faithfulness of people. Okay? So if the people are unfaithful, then God isn't unjust or unfair or unfaithful in not bringing about the promise. In other words, we can't have God over the barrel. We can't force God's hand, even, well, as he's going to say in the next little question answer session, that it would be utterly foolish to conclude that we can do God a favor by doing what's wrong, by doing what's evil. He comes up in verse 5, he said, if our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, then what shall we say? That God is unjust in bringing his wrath on us? And Paul, almost as if that's too much to say, inserts, I'm using only human reasoning here, only a human argument. Certainly not. Certainly not. If that were so, how could God judge the world? Someone might argue, if my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? Why not say, Paul says, as some are already slanderously claiming we say, let's do evil that good may result. Why not just go ahead and say it? That it doesn't matter what we do, that even in our evil, even in our unfaithfulness, even in our sinfulness, God's made to look good because he accepts even those who are unfaithful, even those who are unjust, even those who are unrighteous. In other words, aren't we doing God a favor by giving him an opportunity to manifest, to reveal, to magnify his glory and his grace and his mercy? Paul's only response to that argument or that logic, that vein of thinking is their condemnation is deserved or just. That argument holds no water. That question makes no sense. It would be utterly impossible for us to conclude that we're doing somehow God a favor by being unfaithful to God. And then he comes to verse 9. And here's where, if you're reading from the New International Version, it seems a little bit confusing because it almost sounds like it's a repeat of the question that's already been asked back up in verse 1, is what advantage then is there to being a Jew? He comes to verse 9 and he says, what shall we conclude then? What shall we conclude then? Do we have any advantage? Not at all. Not at all, he says. Now let me pause right there and let's talk about this question. You see, the question that was asked in verse 1 of chapter 3, it's almost as if they were saying, well, Paul, it sounds like you're saying that the Jews are not, there's no advantage, there's no benefit to having been born a Jew, in being circumcised, in receiving the law. And Paul says, no, you're wrong about that. You're wrong about that. The Jews are greatly advantaged. Okay? They had many more opportunities. They had many more privileges. They had many more freedoms. They had much more revelation from God. They had much more protection from God. They had many more promises from God. But did any of those promises or any of that provision or any of that protection or any of that revelation or any of those things, in fact, all those things put together that put the Jews in an advantaged situation, did any of those things that put them there added together put them in a position of spiritual superiority? In other words, are we in fact, because we've been greatly advantaged, any better off spiritually than the Gentiles? And he says, not at all. Not at all. In fact, we would say it this way. No, Jews and Gentiles were both in the same boat regarding their condemnation or their unjust unrighteousness before God. Not at all, he says, for we have already made the claim or the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. You know, that's a frightening thought if you just stop for a minute there. If you just pause and contemplate that statement. And of course, we know that it's true because it's scripture and it's consistent with everything Paul said thus far, as we would expect in the revelation from God. But it's kind of frightening if you stop and think about it. That if you think about all the things that God provided, all the promises that he made, all the protections that he offered, all the provisions and resources that he made available to the Jews, that none of those put them in a superior spiritual position. Why? Because it caused in them, Paul's going to say later in the book, the desire to establish their own righteousness rather than to accept the righteousness of God. In other words, they thought we can do it. We're better than the Gentiles. Now, even if they had known that they maybe weren't perfect, they could push that out of their mind and say, well, at least we're better off than they are. At least we're in a better position than they are. And by the way, God promised us that we're his people. He gave us circumcision as a sign of our relationship. He gave us the law, for goodness sake. And Paul takes each of those things, which were advantages, which were blessings. He takes each one of those things and one by one breaks them down to realize, to make the case for the fact that rather than producing righteousness, what the law did was produce guilt. It wasn't the law's fault. It wasn't because the law was faulty. It wasn't because God was unfaithful. It was because we've been deeply flawed and we can't live by law. We can't be justified by law. Now, as if the case hasn't already been made, Paul's going to quote from a series of Old Testament texts, which, by the way, would have been very familiar to the Jew particularly. He begins in verse 10. He said, just as it has been written, just as the Old Testament scriptures say, there's no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands, no one who seeks God. Now, let me pause here and say to you that sometimes a skeptic or a doubter reads into this text that God's saying, there's no one who will be saved. That's not what he's saying. What he's dealing with is the fact that no one can be righteous by their own performance. He's not saying that Abraham wasn't saved by faith, as the Hebrew writer in chapter 11 says that he was, or that a lot of other people in the Old Covenant or in the Old Testament weren't saved by their faith. What he's saying is that by their own nature, by our own performance under whether it was the law written on the Gentiles' heart or the law revealed at Mount Sinai for the Jews, that there's no one righteous, not even one. Not even one. All have turned together or have turned away and have together become worthless. There's no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves, their tongues practice deceit, the poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are filled with cursing and bitterness, their feet are swift to shed blood, ruin and misery marks their way, and the way of peace they have not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. And that's a pretty frightening or a pretty sobering list of quotes from the Old Testament, isn't it? The conclusion of which is, beginning in verse 19, now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law. Now, I mean, the logic of that almost goes without saying, doesn't it? That if the Jews were given the great advantage of having much more law, then what standard will they be held to? Much more law. If the Gentiles were given a law written on their hearts back in chapter 1 and 2, then what standard are they going to be held to? The standard that they've been revealed, the standard that they've been given. We know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth will be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Now, that's a simple way, or maybe a complex way, in fact, of saying a man who receives revelation from God, a man who's given insight, revelation concerning the nature and the character of God, finds himself in a position of accountability or responsibility in either living up to that standard or failing to live up to that standard. And so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God, whether it's a little bit of law or a whole lot of law, whether it's a law of Moses or a law written on the Gentile's heart, or any other law of works, any other pursuit of self-righteousness under a judgment based on our performance. The outcome is always the same. It's always the same. And the outcome is in verse 20, therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by works of law. Any law, any system of works, any system that judges a man on the basis of his performance to the revelation of God results in condemnation. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by works of law. Rather, what the law does do is make us conscious of our sin, make us realize how deeply we need a Savior. Now, let me conclude this, and I'm almost out of time, so let me wrap it up and make a conclusion here. A lot of doctrine, a lot of powerful statements made, a lot of life-changing information revealed here. But the simple truth is that Paul's leading us into the position of realizing how desperately needful we are for a Savior, for a Redeemer. Someone to buy us back from the position of sinfulness and condemnation that we've deserved, that we've earned, that we've worked ourselves into. We need someone to pay the price to buy us back. We need someone to do for us what we could never do for ourselves, no matter whether we had a little bit of law or a whole lot of law, whether we're Jew or whether we're Gentile. What the law does do, what the law did do, and continues doing, at least for those who are honest, who are honest with themselves. Well, certainly God's judgment is going to be honest. What the law does do is make us aware of how sinful we really are, how desperate our condition really is, how needful a Redeemer, a Savior is for me. Now, again, as I've said, we devise a lot of strategies to try to evade that conclusion. We talk about little white lies. We talk about, I'm not as bad as, or we talk about, well, at least I haven't. We've got all kinds of little unique strategies to try to deny the fact that we're sinful. But only when we recognize our sinfulness are we going to be eager to accept and prepared to share the good news that's about to come beginning in verse 21 of chapter 3. I really appreciate the fact that you've been tuned in, not just to this lesson. I hope that you've been with us for the previous lessons, because they all build one upon another to this final conclusion that a man can't be right with God by his own performance under law. It can't happen. It's an impossibility. And God says that that's true. And by the way, it wasn't the purpose of law. It wasn't the reason God gave law. Law of Moses or the law written on our heart or any other law. to redeem us, to save us. That could only happen through Jesus. That's why Jesus, God, knew even before the creation of the world the sacrifice that Jesus would have to make to redeem humanity. What the law was designed to do, among many other things, in the context of salvation, is to make us realize how bad we need to be saved. How bad we need to be saved. I hope that you've enjoyed or benefited from this series, and we're going to continue. I'm not finishing or not saying that we're not going to go on, but it's important that we understand the fact that in order for me to be right with God, I'm going to have someone else buy me back from the position that I've earned myself into. There's going to have to be something done on my behalf that I've been totally ineffective and unable to do for myself. That's where we begin the good news of the book of Romans in chapter 3, verse 21. What we've proven thus far is we're hopeless. We're helpless. We're pitiful. Whether we've been given a great revelation from God or whether we've been given a very small, relatively speaking, amount of revelation from God, we've mishandled it. We've suppressed the truth. And suppressing the truth always leads to the same thing, always leads to the same outcome, the same consequence or result. I'm going to stop here for this morning. Put your marker, if you would, at verse 21. We're going to begin in chapter 3, verse 21, and go all the way through the end of chapter 5. And we're going to now be talking not about condemnation, but we're going to be talking about justification. Okay? Justification, how to be right with God. And that's really good news. That's what we've been eagerly anticipating or building up to all along. Appreciate you tuning in. Leave us a comment. Share this with someone else. If you have any questions, please feel free to write those, to email me those to, it's jstegall, STEGALL, at PV, Parkview, pvfamily.org. Would be happy to hear from you. I'd love to hear from you, whether it's a question, a comment, or even a criticism, if it's constructively given. I'd love to hear how much of an impact this is having, or how this has been beneficial or otherwise to me, for me to regulate or me to determine how, whether this is something that's beneficial to others or not. Thank you for your attention. Hope that you'll tune in again for our next week's lesson.